tap and I'll begin. Yeah, I just heard it. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Happy almost Friday. I am Alexandra DeCoco. I am the program assistant with the Foresight Strategy and Risks Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. Our speakers are going to join us in just a minute, but I wanted to give you a quick overview of something we're trying out at today's event. You got a few emails from me, if you're here sitting in the room today, about how we will be doing an audience poll and about voting in that poll by using Mentimeter.com. As you'll see, we have the QR code up on the screen. If you could go to menti.com and use the code 717146 or simply scan that QR code, you can participate in our audience poll. Today's event is going to talk about a survey that Pew Research Center did over about the last year or so, where they surveyed people from all over the world and asked them what they believe the biggest threats to their country are currently. Now, Jacob Pushter, who is the lead researcher on that survey, will be here and he's going to present it. But we also want to compare some of your thoughts and your views to the views that Pew found in their research. So please participate in the poll. We'll get started in about 2 or 3 more minutes, and you can also ask any questions that you would like of our panel through the poll, the audience poll, and then we'll also do audience Q&A. All right, if you have any questions, you can come and find me, and we'll get started in a few minutes.
talking points.
Yeah.
Hey, how are you?
Well, welcome, everybody, and thanks for coming on this wonderful day, actually. So my name is Matt Burrows. I'm the director of the Foresight Strategy and Risk Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And at the Atlantic Council, we have a series called The America's Role in the World, and it serves as a forum for discussions and advice on strategy and a platform for prominent U.S. Public leaders to express their views on the U.S.'s role in the world. Now, this session is part of that series. We're going to go a little bit more global, looking at the global risks facing the world, and we're actually going to discuss and debate the findings of a recent Pew Research Center survey on that topic of global threats. Now, for the past decade or so, we have witnessed major shifts across the world, from migration and the ongoing refugee crisis, non-state actors like ISIS, and obviously global phenomenon like climate change. And all of that has changed the landscape, national security and the broader international security landscape. In a few moments, Jacob Pauscher, a leading expert on global threats, will present Pew's findings, focusing on which of those threats are considered the most dangerous to Americans compared to voices Europe, Asia, etc. Before he comes to the stage, I have a few quick reminders. First, vote. Be sure you do that. Secondly, this session is on the record, so just keep that in mind as we get into the discussion and the debate. And we also are using the hashtag AC strategy. This session is also being webcast live and is, as I mentioned before, on the record. So with that, I want to turn the floor over to Jacob, who will start with about a 15-20 minute presentation on the Pew survey. Thank you, Jacob, for being here.
Hello, everyone. Whoop, that's loud. Thanks for coming today. I'm going to go over the results of this report that we put out a couple weeks ago. It will look at the results that we did based on a 38-country survey in the spring of 2017, so back in February through May, and it will show basically the results of a question we asked about on a list of possible international concerns, which among these would you rate as a major threat, a minor threat, or not a threat at all. And all the responses that you'll see, all those percentages, will be those who say that these various 8 threats that we chose are a major threat. Obviously, the list that we came up with was determined late last year, so there might be some things on there that you would expect that are not there right now, but in the future, we'll probably be able to repeat this question again and see in the future what other threats are coming to the globe. And people, if you have any suggestions on what we should ask in the future, feel free to offer what those shall be. So the main finding is that across these 38 countries, the threat that people seem to name the most are Islamic militant group known as ISIS and global climate change. A median of 62% across these 38 countries say that ISIS is a major threat, and a similar 61% across these 38 countries say that climate change is a major threat. You'll see from this chart that the next 2 threats that were listed at about half of the global population are cyber attacks from other countries and the condition of the global economy. So economic concerns, worries about cyber attacks are the second ranked threats among these 38 countries. The refugee crisis, specifically the large number of refugees leaving Iraq and Syria, is next on the list at a median of 39% across these 38 countries. And finally, at the bottom, about a third of the public named the power and influence of the United States, Russia, and China as a major threat to their countries. So across the globe, these are the general results across these 8 battery item questions in which we asked in the spring of 2017. But you'll see that on an individual country level basis, that the top threat in each country can vary greatly based on where people are in the world and what type of experiences they've had. So you'll notice that those who name ISIS as a top threat tend to be concentrated in Europe, the Middle East, Russia, and parts of Southeast Asia, Australia, and the United States, all places which have actually experienced terrorist attacks over the past couple years and have more experience with that as a threat. But you'll notice too that on the issue of climate change, you have many people in Latin America, places in sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Europe, as well as Mexico and Canada, saying that climate change is the greatest threat. From our research in past on the climate change, Latin Americans tend to be more concerned about the threat of climate change versus other regions in the world, and that works too when we give them this list of items that are possible threats to them. There are a couple outliers in there. Greece and Venezuela. The condition of the global economy is their biggest worry, obviously related to their own country's economic situation. Cyber attacks are the top fear in Japan. The influence of China is on South Korea and Vietnam. And then refugees are the biggest threat for people in Hungary. And then Turkey, where unfortunately we were not able to ask about ISIS, the top threat there is the US power and influence. So you'll see that this is also a regional story, as I was saying right before. So in Europe, ISIS and global climate change are the top 2 threats, but ISIS is much higher, with other threats being much lower. In the Asia Pacific, both ISIS and climate change rise to the top as major threats, with the other issues being lower down, except for China, which sort of sticks out because of the threat that is perceived in Vietnam and South Korea. In the Middle East, unfortunately, because Turkey, we couldn't ask about ISIS in Turkey, the top threat is technically the condition of global economy by medians, but really in 4 of the 5 other countries in which we asked about ISIS, it actually rose to the top as the top threat, including 97% in Lebanon, which is a very high number in public opinion research. In Africa, there's sort of a mixture of threats. They sort of saw most of the threats we asked about as majorities said that they were major threats to them. But at the top is global climate change. And then, as I said earlier, in Latin America, global climate change really is at the top of the list of global threats, with the condition of the global economy being second in that region. So it is a story of region in addition to country. So let's just go by region and show you how the results varied in each of these areas and some sort of highlights of it. So as I said earlier, ISIS is the top threat in many European countries, including 88% in France, 85% in Italy, 77% in Germany, and 70% in the UK, obviously all places that have had attacks inspired or carried out by ISIS over the past couple years. And then the US and Russia are 2 other countries among these where ISIS is the top concern. Climate change is the top concern for Spanish, but really there's not much difference between climate change and ISIS, and also in Sweden, but also in Canada. So you do see a couple countries where global climate change goes to the top of the list as a major threat. Cyber attacks, while no country picks it as its top threat, it's pretty high in a lot of countries, including the United States, where 71% say that cyber attacks are a major threat, one of the highest numbers on that question that we had in the entire survey. As I said earlier, Poland and Hungary sort of stick out for their worries about refugees, same as Italy and Greece. Generally in southern and southeastern Europe, there is more concern about the refugee issue, and there's more negative views towards outsiders or minorities in those regions compared to the rest of Europe, Northern Europe, where the refugee issue isn't really seen as a major threat. And then, of course, Greece is the outlier over here, where 88% say the condition of the global economy is the major threat. Obviously, they've had a rough go of economic conditions there, and that there is a correlation that as people say that their economic conditions are worse in their home country, they're more likely to say that the condition of the global economy is a major threat to them. So it makes sense that in a place like Greece and Venezuela, they're more concerned about the condition of the global economy. Within the countries, there's some interesting ideological splits. Those on the right end of the ideological spectrum who identify themselves as right are more likely to both say that the refugee issue is a major threat and that ISIS is a major threat. And this is clear across most of the European and North American countries in which we surveyed. So in the United States, those who describe themselves as conservative are 46 percentage points more likely to say that refugees are a major threat to the United States compared to those who describe themselves as liberals on the left. So there's a very large gap in terms, from an ideological standpoint, on these two major threats that people are worried about, but certain people within these countries are more worried about them. And the same pattern exists in ISIS in most countries, where people on the right are more worried about the threat of ISIS than those on the left. Another divide that we saw is by education, especially in the refugee issue. Those with less education are more likely to name the refugee crisis as a major threat compared to those who have less education. And this is pretty clear throughout most of Europe and the United States. And as obviously, if you were paying attention to elections and referenda over the past year, this split is apparent not just on views of these threats, but on other issues that are endemic to these countries. And then one final split on the opposite way is views of climate change. Those on the left are more concerned about global climate change than those on the right. In the United States, it's a gigantic difference. 86% of those on the left say that climate change is a major problem versus 31% on the right, so a 55 percentage point difference. So we do see these partisan differences among these countries on the views of what is a major threat. So politics extends beyond domestic issues to global threats in general. Going back to looking at the various regions that we see, Asia Pacific is a little more varied in the concerns there. A lot of countries say that ISIS is the top concern. Again, Indonesia, Philippines, India, Australia, all places that have experienced either ISIS-related or ISIS-funded attacks. Japan sort of stands out for its worries about cyber attacks. And then South Korea and Vietnam really are two of the only countries that name China's power and influence as a major threat. I haven't mentioned much about China's power and influence, Russia's power and influence as a major threat. Russia is obviously more worrying to Poles than it is anywhere else. And then China is more worrying to South Koreans and Vietnamese than it is everywhere else. So that it is one other possible threat to them that other places around the globe would not necessarily pick. But you can see from the list that we had, we did not include North Korea as a global threat. We finalized our questionnaire in late 2016 before many of the recent tests and provocations. But we did ask a separate question in just the Asia Pacific about whether North Korea, whether they're concerned about North Korea having nuclear weapons. And as you can see, many are very concerned, although I will note that the Japanese and Americans are more concerned than other people on this issue, more pointedly concerned, where about 2/3 say that they're very concerned about the weapons program versus 59% of South Koreans. So there is a degree of worry in Japan and US that somewhat outstrips other Asian nations, but some Asian nations don't really, it's not as much of a worry as it is for some of the ones on top. And hopefully in the future we'll be able to take a global read on the North Korean threat, especially after the past year. In the Middle East, we see, as I said earlier, across the 4 countries where we could ask about ISIS, majorities say that it is a major threat, including 97% in Lebanon, which is a very large number, but also 79% in Tunisia, 76% in Jordan, and 63% in Israel. And then in Turkey, where we were, the questions we were allowed to ask, the US power and influence rises to the top as some of the greatest concerns there, but they're also concerned about refugees. And the Middle East is also secondarily concerned about the condition of the global economy, pretty high numbers from those. In Africa, climate change in 4 countries, Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, Senegal, ISIS in 2 other countries, Ghana and Nigeria. But generally, 58% median across these 6 countries versus 51% median, generally high worries about global threats in many of the African countries in which we surveyed. But climate change does rise to the top here. And then finally, in Latin America, as I said earlier, very concerned about global climate change. 6 of the 7 countries say that it's a major threat to their country, more than majorities, 2/3 or more. The only country that doesn't have it as the top is Venezuela, but that's only 1 point difference between those who say the condition of the global economy is a major threat versus those who say global climate change is a major threat. So really clear answer in Latin America for this question on what's the greatest global threat. One final thing before I finish my presentation, the question we asked about US influence, whether it's a major threat, while it wasn't particularly high in many countries with the exception of Turkey, we did see that there was major increase in those who named the United States as a major threat to their country from 2013, the last time we asked this question in all these countries, to 2017. So there was a big change. So in 2013, we asked the same question in Spain among a nationally representative sample. Only 17% said that US power and influence was a major threat to their country. Now in 2017, that number has jumped to 59%. And we see corresponding increases in this number across a large number of the countries in which we surveyed. So there is, at least from our research, a definite increase in those who name the US as a major threat. And we also found corresponding numbers. Those who have a favorable view of the United States have fallen in the past year, and confidence in the US president has also fallen in the last year, which might explain some of these figures. And that would end my portion of the conversation. And I guess if we can all join on stage for a panel, that would be great.
Hi everybody, my name is Kate Brannon. I'm Deputy Managing Editor at Just Security. I used to cover the Pentagon for Foreign Policy and Politico, and I'm also a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm very happy to be here with our panel. Starting at the very end, we've got Jacob from the Pew Research Center. And next we have Ellen Leipzon, who is the Director of the International Security Program at George Mason University. And before that, she was the president of the Stimson Center for almost 14 years, and before that, in government at the NSC, in the State Department, and elsewhere. Then we have Dave, we have Dave Anderson, who runs the Credit and Political Risk Unit for Zurich North America. And finally, we have Matthew Burrows, who serves as the director here at the Brent Scowcroft Center for the Foresight Strategy and Risks Initiative. So we've heard Jacob's presentation. I have a bunch of questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, and we'll also discuss your own voting results about global threats as well. For me, the big takeaway was how out of step the US perception of climate change is as a global threat. It didn't feature very much in the election. It wasn't asked during the presidential debates. To the whole panel, I wanted to ask sort of how do you explain that divide between the US view of that as a threat versus the rest of the world, and if anybody wants to sort of bring it into more recent context with the departure from the Paris Climate Accord and what sort of US leadership on that issue says going forward. And whoever wants to take that first, please feel free.
Jason, I think if you went to Texas or Florida and did this poll, you might get some very different numbers now. So I think the United States is in a temperate climate zone. The entire country isn't yet directly experiencing what a lot of the other countries in the survey are, although significant portions of the United States are certainly starting to wake up to the way that climate change in its various forms is going to change livelihoods and lives and, you know, our property and other things. But I wonder whether it's also that our political debate about climate change lags behind other countries, that other countries have been more forward-leaning in recognizing its impact on their own national security. I should say, though, that I think the United States has come a long way and is continuing to evolve. We do know that at the state level, not at the federal level, at the state level, there's a lot of political support for climate change compliance. And I think what we've seen post-Paris Accord in terms of the Trump administration's policy is that even at the level of municipalities and in governors' mansions, there are commitments to stick with the rules and the guidelines of the Paris Accord, even if at the federal government we've shifted the policy. So. But I do think that if you look at the countries that are most affected, it is countries of the southern hemisphere that are feeling it first, and that I think have And then, of course, the Nordics are feeling it because of changes in the Arctic. But so I do think that over time it will grow. I did think it was striking that India, a country whose policy towards climate change has actually changed quite a lot, and was eventually, on board for a global accord, was the only Asian country that I think was below 50% of people. It was 47%, I think. So I was struck that the India number was also low, like the United States.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to chime in on?
I'll just say that one of the reasons the United States is probably lower on that particular number is that the partisan divide is greater than any other country in which we've surveyed, that we asked the question. So a 55 percentage point difference between conservatives and liberals in the U.S. means that the overall number is going to invariably be lower if a large portion of the U.S. population doesn't see it as a major threat. So that partisan divide is part of the story you'll see on climate change in the United States that's been around for a while, but there are other questions that we've asked and whatever question we ask on environmental issues tend to have that partisan divide in the United States. That is not necessarily the case in other European nations.
I'm just thinking about what Ellen said about how the more southern countries feel it first, and in this case, in the United States, those aren't necessarily blue states, Florida, Texas. So maybe you'll see that narrow to some extent. And in this audience, right now, 51 people have answered the survey, and climate change is the leading threat believed to be facing the country, followed by cyber attacks. After that, the condition of the global economy, and then Russia and China's power and influence in the world follow that. And ISIS is even past that, and rates, so it doesn't add up to what we saw in the Pew report and the global survey. But also, as Jacob was telling us before this got started, these results came in between, was it February and May?
Yes.
Versus, you guys answering the question right now. So that might also have something to do with sort of how you rate. Just, the landscape is different, the threat scenario is different. Which gets to my next question for everybody. What isn't on this list that should be, that surprised you, or that you think should be there?
Well, I'll mention one. So just to give you my perspective, the risks we cover in my particular unit at Zurich Insurance are credit and political risks. So we cover the risks that debtors, be they buyers of goods or borrowers, default on valid contracts around the world. And we also cover the risks on the political risk side that a company's assets might get expropriated, or political violence, meaning any politically motivated violence might damage their assets, or currency and convertibility might occur. So you have local currency, you can't get it out of the country. These are the kinds of risks that we worry about in my particular unit. So in terms of, another report that I work on or contribute to is the Global Risk Report that the World Economic Forum puts out. And one particular risk, and all these risks are interconnected, and maybe we'll have a conversation about that later in the panel. But we've had very low commodity prices over the past 3 years, and those are now coming back up. But the impact of that in the emerging markets has been profound. And so you have a number of countries in sovereign default right now, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, but not only sub-Saharan Africa. So, so that has a tremendous impact on the ability and willingness of foreign investors to invest in those countries, at least the investors coming from countries where such things are important. There are a lot of reasons to invest in a country, and some of them might be political, others are people looking for a return on their investment. But if you're looking for a return on your investment and you see that the government's in default and that the economy is in a tailspin, that's obviously going to be difficult to justify on a risk-return sort of basis. So, so that's a big risk that has been there. we're now coming out of that commodity price trough, but the lingering effects of that remain around the world.
Interesting.
The other surprising thing is conflict, right? Obviously North Korea, and I think we discussed that, and that may be because of the, when this poll was taken. But obviously there are concerns about, Russia and NATO, general concerns about U.S.-China tensions, and maybe that's reflected in those concerns about U.S. And China and Russian power and influence. But nevertheless, if you're thinking about, what are the big threats, you usually begin with thinking about conflict. Now, too, you also have ISIS on there, so that's a potential conflict.
Right. When you look at this list of threats, are there ones that you think are overhyped, like the public's getting it wrong on it, or aren't being taken seriously enough and should maybe be boosted higher?
I think if you asked, I obviously do not speak for the entire private sector, but I think if you did the same poll with just CEOs, they would put cyber at the top of the list, because it reaches every company everywhere, and it's costing billions of dollars a year. And no matter how much a company spends on protecting their IT infrastructure, there's no 100% solution to protect the company. So, so that one is probably at the top of the list for the private sector.
Okay.
And the other one, as I remember from the World Economic Forum's Global Threat Index, would be populism, government instability. Obviously there's a reflection of the fears at the beginning of the year, but that is a real concern, I think, broadly in most countries. Can governments actually function?
This question's for everybody too, but it struck me that the political situation in the U.S. does feel unstable. There's so much drama, so much unpredictability, and yet, and maybe this is a question more for Dave, but the market doesn't seem to, the global market doesn't really seem to reflect that. And is that shift coming, or is Washington's sort of influence overhyped, or how do you sort of explain that seeming difference?
I wish I could. I wish I could. Yeah, I mean, you don't see the risk reflected in stock market prices, and it seems that generally we're in a returning economic growth cycle around the world, and so that's part of what the commodity price story as well. In terms of equity prices, it's I think corporate profits are doing quite well right now, and so that's in there regardless of all this uncertainty. It really hasn't affected corporate profits yet, but news can affect the market, so we'll see.
Ellen?
So I wonder if we want to make a distinction between the sort of inside the Beltway dramas of the week versus the more longer playing story of the decline of American power and influence in the world. So I thought it was striking, and we should ask Jason to tell us more, that the discussion of countries that ranked America's power and influence in the world high, and the Turks were outliers on that question. What's the thought behind that? Is it too much power, too little power? I mean, they're worried about the U.S. role in the world, but are we extrapolating too much to say that they're worried about a loss of American power and influence in the world, or might it be something much more, immediate in focus? They just don't like U.S. policy towards their country or towards their region. So I did wonder what that meant, but I think that is separable from the immediate politics of the day.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk?
I mean, yes. So when we ask this question, we ask whether the U.S. power and influence is a major threat. We don't specify whether it's lack of power and influence or whether it's because the United States is projecting its power and influence more. So it's unknowable to know what each individual person who answered the question. We do expect it to be somewhat related to U.S. image overall, and we did see in this survey similar questions about the United States and the president, where favorability towards the United States in general fell pretty precipitously in a lot of countries, in almost every country in which we surveyed, besides Russia and Israel, the only two countries where it went up. Views of President Trump were much lower than views of President Obama. So we do assume that when people are saying that the influence of the U.S. is a great threat, it means because of less favorable views towards the United States.
Just for point of clarification, I thought the slide said too much power and influence.
Just power and influence generally.
Power and influence.
Yeah, it doesn't specify whether it's too much or too little. But again, because for example, on the China question, that the high threat values were registered in South Korea and Vietnam, and that the high threat values for Russia were registered in Poland, it tends to be worries about them as a direct threat to them, not necessarily as lacking international power.
Back to Dave, and staying in this kind of area of the question, what are companies worried about? What's the corporate world worried about when it comes to U.S. power and influence? Is it more predictability? Is it stepping back from engagement with multilateral institutions? Where do their concerns come in?
I think that it's not just U.S. power and influence. I think it's Western power and influence. And one of the things that private sector firms rely upon is an understanding of what the rules of the game are when they're making the investment, and the hope that those rules won't change over time. Because when you're deciding to make an investment, you do cash flow projection, you make assumptions about taxes and various regulations that are going to affect how that's going to go. If everything's just all over the place all the time, then that makes that planning process very difficult. And so, to the extent that Western influence diminishes in the emerging markets, I think that the rules of the game become murkier. And actually, and this particularly comes up with one of our coverages, which is expropriation. So when a government actually takes your asset and doesn't compensate you for it. If the concept of international law becomes weaker around the world, then it's possible that the idea of expropriating assets may become, not such a big deal. So that's worrisome. And the West, represents the idea of an independent judicial system with professionals making usually objective decisions about such things, about disputes, and the idea of ownership of private property, generally a Western concept. So to the extent that that comes into question, companies would worry about that.
As you're talking, I was just thinking, take the oil as a U.S. erosion of that concept. President Trump during the campaign about Iraq taking the oil and chipping away at sort of the international legal norms. I wanted to ask about cyber, but all of the threats. Which of these threats are sort of least understood, do you think, by the public? And how does that factor into how people think about them? I was just thinking about cyber attacks because I was curious if you polled the same group of people and asked them what a cyber attack is, you might get very different answers as well.
We did not specify. We made it pretty general so that it would translate across the 38 countries. But the people that we used to translate told us that it would be understandable in each of the countries what we were talking about when we asked that question. So we assumed that it was comparable across those countries, what we would understand as a cyber attack.
Okay.
I think one thing that is not well understood by the public, and I don't think it's understood by the private sector and many governments either, is how interconnected all the risks are. Climate change affects a lot of things, and it affects political risk in the sense of creating scarce resources, which then puts stress on populations, and that can have a number of effects. It can increase violence, it can increase migration and refugees. It can affect the economy, which then causes losses to firms investing in those countries. So it's the interconnectedness of all these risks that's really tough to put together. Zurich does make an attempt at it that I think is pretty good. We have something called the Zurich Risk Room that can actually show you correlations as certain risks rise. What does it do to other risks? So that's one thing that we try to show our customers, and actually anybody can download it. We have a website where you can look at it.
But I do think that the logic of your question is that, you know, cyber, most of us are a little bit lower on the learning curve on what cyber attacks are like. I think people see it at the very individual level of the compromises of our identity, the loss of privacy, of these sweeping, leaks of proprietary information. But we've never really seen the catastrophic cyber attack that would shut down major infrastructure or would, the collapse of the banking system. So I think we are still shy of feeling, we haven't had a 9/11 in cyber yet. So I don't think people have quite yet a three-dimensional understanding of how it can impact them. They know pieces of the story, but they don't know the whole thing yet.
How good is the U.S. government at forecasting risk? Is it getting any better at it?
Well, one of the problems is that there are so many different risks, and as Dave was saying, you can talk about each individual risk, but oftentimes the biggest risks are kind of in the intersection between them. And both Ellen and I have experience where, in all the work we were doing, you introduce scenarios so you can get people to look at some of those interconnections and the possibilities. Overall, I think, I have experience that dates before 9/11 and experience after 9/11. I think the idea of and the acceptance of risk, even risk that looks very unlikely, has grown. Because in this country we had, what seemed like a extremely improbable attack and took everybody or most people by surprise. So in a sense, with that in everybody's mind, you actually can make an argument about a lot of these risks and ones that may not be seen at first glance anyways as a major risk. The problem is where you go after that. And I can remember, General Clapper, the former DNI, at one point, because we used to every year put together a threat assessment that went to the public, and him saying, he wished for the days of the Cold War. Because you had this very much simpler, the risks are all on one's coming from one Moscow or Beijing, and we're on the other side. And things seemed a little bit simpler, and I think that is the real problem we're facing.
When you look at what the survey results were for last year, the year before, is that accelerated change reflected? I mean, is this list kind of constantly resorting itself?
We actually try to change the list to make sure it's keeping up with the events of the day and the threats that are there. So, we've tracked some things over the past 4 years that have fluctuated. Climate change has tended to be among the top threats that we ask, no matter how we ask it. Terrorism, however we ask it, tends to also be among the top threats. One thing that has abated in the last couple of years is condition of the global economy, as a lot of individual countries have felt more confident about their own economic situation, and when they feel more confident about their own economic situation, they tend to say that the condition of the global economy is not as much of a threat. And as I said earlier, the US as a threat has risen a lot in the last couple years, but no other trends from that matter. I mean, whether we ask in the future about the refugees now that the crisis has somewhat abated, or in the future we ask more about North Korea or Iran, it might depend on what's going on in the world. So it's not, we're flexible in what kind of questions we can ask to these publics, and I'm interested to see what in the future those kinds of risks might be that people are aware of enough to answer the questions.
Okay, I have a bunch more questions, but I'm going to start taking some questions from the audience. First, I have a few questions that we got through the internet, and I'm going to see if there are some good ones in here. Let's see, if anyone, I'll take a peek at this while we take a question from the audience, if anybody has one. Yeah, up front.
Are a combination of threats that had been asked in prior surveys and those that we thought rose to the level of global concerns. There's not many things that could affect every country in the world, so there's not a huge list, but there has to be choices made, because typically you can only ask about 6 to 8 questions. Each respondent was able to answer whether it was a major threat, a minor threat, or not a threat at all, or refused to answer the question. The percentages that I showed you up there were only those who said it was a major threat. There were other portions of the survey where people were asked about other things that they might consider a threat, such as territorial disputes in the South China Sea, such as the EU's handling of the refugee crisis, views of extremism in Western Europe and the Middle East, but those were other questions asked within the survey. On this particular question, there was no place to add an additional, I think this is a major threat, although, if we go back through the audio or, what interviewers dealt with, I'm sure people had their own opinions that they could have added on. But for this, no, it was a defined list of threats that we had come up with internally for our survey.
I have a question here about the global populist trend, which probably, you said you designed these questions, I think, the week of the election or the week after the election. So at that point, we did have Trump and we had Brexit. But does the global populist trend continue? And if so, how does it contribute to a more stable or unstable world, for whoever wants to take it?
I mean, in the European Union, we've found that generally people don't have particularly warm feelings towards populist parties, such as AfD in Germany, National Front in France, UKIP in the United Kingdom. It's not they're not as well liked as other political parties in those countries, although in many of those countries no political party is really liked. So we do see that outside of the actual elections and referenda, that we see people in the European Union, for example, are still not happy with how the European Union is handling the refugee issue, how they're handling the economy. So there's still these disruptions among in political systems that we see in our polling, but it's a little harder to grasp from survey research on whether this this populism is more a function of anti-refugee sentiment, or is it more a function of economic worries? And we haven't gotten to a point where we can actually measure it as its own thing in and of itself. We know from elections that there's been temporary spikes in those who will vote for a populist leader, but in our own surveys, we don't have anything definitive yet about what the movement means or how long it might last.
That's interesting. Ellen?
So I was just going to extrapolate beyond the data and say that I wondered whether it was that 2016 was a spike year because of the refugee crisis, and as the refugee crisis evens off or tapers off, and there's just the dramatic drop in the number of people getting in, whether the populist parties in a country like Hungary or the receiving countries would sort of max out at 20 to 30% of the population or something like that. That I don't think we can yet see any country where it's becoming truly a majority of voters. It may be enough to be a much more important political force than it has been in the past, but I wonder whether we'll see that it either stabilizes at something below 50% or even tapers off if the refugee crisis becomes a historic crisis and not an ongoing crisis.
And
And the Netherlands, I mean, then we would be talking about populism. And
how about here in this country where we didn't directly experience the refugee crisis the way they obviously did in Europe? Is it quite as tied to that issue? Will it taper off in the same way? How would you sort of forecast?
Well, we didn't get the refugees, but we had managed to gin up a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, so we did it without the same immediate experience that the Europeans had. But perhaps, as you said, that if you compare sort of general economic conditions versus fear of the outsider or the foreigner or the refugee, maybe in the U.S. case, economic factors would have just been more prominent in the rise of populism.
Okay. Anybody else in the audience?
Thanks. There's one really big threat that really stood out to me that wasn't mentioned, and that's the pandemic threat, the human security threat. I mean, every 100 years, statistically, there is a major pandemic. I just wondered why that wasn't discussed, because millions of people die every year, much more than some of these combined. And just what's your thought on the global health threat and by extension, the pandemic threat?
In the United States, we did ask earlier in the year about Zika in particular, and in the past we've asked about like bird flu and various sort of newsworthy things that the general population would be aware of. It's harder to ask more generally about things that might not happen or people might not be aware of. So we need particular instances of them happening before we can ask about a threat. But it is an interesting question whether in the future we could ask more about using a phraseology that would lead people to understand the potential of movement of viruses and medical bio issues that might affect their lives. So it is definitely something that, it's an interesting concept we've done in the past and we might do in the future.
I have a question here about ISIS, which we should probably address, seeing as it was the top threat ranked. The question is, can ISIS be destroyed, or have they reshaped the global threat, and opened Pandora's box, evolving and moving across the globe physically and virtually, which gets to something I was thinking about, which if ISIS is defeated on the battlefield, what replaces it? Is a broader threat of terrorism still there? What's the panel's thinking about sort of the evolution of the ISIS threat and where it's headed?
Yeah, I think the presence of ISIS, at the top of the list, has everything to do with their online presence, and not so much to do with what's going on the battlefield. I think that the idea that someone can be inspired by ISIS and pop up in any town anywhere is really the issue. From our point of view in the credit and political risk unit, their military presence being limited to Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and a bit in North Africa, the amount of investment going into those countries isn't of a level where a lot of companies are going to come to us anyway, because they're not willing to make the investment for other reasons. So as a result, they don't want coverage for it. but the online presence and the fact that they can spread just by mode of thought, and the possibility that they can get into places with a large amount of investment, such as the Persian Gulf countries, I think is the threat that companies think about in particular.
Anybody else want to talk about ISIS?
Extremism and terrorism in general tend to rise to the top of problems or concerns in almost all the countries in which we survey. So economic concerns are almost always at top, whether it's inflation or unemployment. But terrorism, extremism is also another, and anything that's sort of violence related tends to rise to the top of these lists because it can direct them more personally. And on the findings from this report, as I said, it seems that the countries that have experienced direct attacks in the last couple of years are more concerned. So there's also, this has affected my life, this has affected our country. People are reacting to the fact that can happen anywhere, where, for something like global climate change, it might not affect all places at all times. It might not be as personal to people, where what's happening in the news cycle and sort of as David said, it's like a branding almost of ISIS as a well-known figure, as a well-known extremist group.
Staying on ISIS, another question from the audience about ISIS. Is the ISIS threat status in the U.S., the results that we see, is that because of the success of U.S. government messaging or because they truly are an existential threat to the national security? I think this gets to the question of, is the ISIS threat in the U.S. being perceived accurately, or is it being overhyped, or what? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think we're ultra sensitive. Even though the attacks may have happened in Berlin or London, Paris, we believe, and I think it probably is a good idea to think that yes, they could happen here. And having a history now, that we see ourselves as still very vulnerable, even though, most experts believe that we have hardened our borders. But nevertheless, you have enough incidents of appeal to people inside the U.S. So again, I think the history, it's not that long ago where we had a major attack, and obviously our own history of involvement in the Middle East means that we're very sensitive to that issue.
I do wonder, is the percentage between, or the difference of percentages between Western Europe and the U.S. as or looking at the ISIS threat, it doesn't seem to be that big of a difference. But I'm from the Netherlands myself, so for us it's like a very continuous threat. It feels like everything's happening very close to us, and it's a continuous thing that's in the news every day. So I wonder why. Is it just because of 9/11 that the U.S. feels that this is still an option, or because how is the difference not bigger between Western Europe and the U.S. perceiving the threat of ISIS?
They're not the same, right? One thing about these questions is that certain publics are more concerned about everything compared to others. So like the Spanish are particularly concerned about all major threats compared to, say, the Netherlands or Germany. So we do see there has to be some sort of, you have to be somewhat careful about saying, oh, the Spanish are the most concerned, because it has to be relative to the other threats that we're showing. But even in Europe, the ISIS threat, I believe, was higher than, the median of it was higher than climate change. So it is definitely an area that has been targeted of attacks in the past, and therefore is more concerned about it. And despite the U.S. maybe being more insular, has had a major attack in the past 15 years that are in the minds of people when they answer these questions, which probably leads people to have a higher threat value.
Yep, right here.
I'd like to pick up on Matt's point. I'm Robert Shredder, international investor. Is it possible? I wish we could see that list of the top threats again. I don't know if you're video person can quickly do that. But is it possible that, of course, the media is generating a lot of the concerns in the public's, and those threats that lend themselves to more visualizations, big hurricanes, ISIS attacks, where you can look at the damage and et cetera afterward, rather than, let's say, a global economic issue, which is very hard to visualize for a lot of people, even after the fact, except to perhaps show foreclosed homes or whatever. And it's not the same fantasy, if you will, for the media. So is it possible that this list gets influenced greatly by what makes great video for the television media around the world?
I think that's a factor, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Pew, 5, 6 years ago, the economy would have been much higher simply because most people hadn't felt the recovery. But this links up with a previous question. I think our coverage of what happens in Paris with the terrorist attack is as extensive as in Europe, as in France even. So I think there is a feeling, Americans that that could happen here. And certainly, now that there has been a recovery, people are beginning to feel it. Those kind of threats go up. But I still think, that if we would have been talking here in 2009 or 2010, it would have been all about the economy.
But I almost made a similar point in the discussion of cyber attacks, that there is something kind of remote and abstract and invisible, if you will. And so it is, I do think that in terms of what grabs the gut of people who are answering these questions, the ones that have a more physical dimension to them probably are more understood by people than the ones that are a little esoteric, or somebody has to explain, well, why would that be relevant to me? Well, actually a cyber attack could empty your bank account or something, but it's not in the first order so self-evident to people. Yeah.
Interesting that it's about cyber attacks too, and sort of their elusiveness, but accounting for that, cyber attacks rate pretty high on the list, and then the Russia and Chinese power and influence are a little bit lower, but tying what Russia and China do in the cyber realm, sort of how do you tie those two threats together, and do people sort of view cyber attacks as coming from a certain place, or are they sort of this anonymous thing that happens to you?
Interesting question. I don't know if we've asked that particular question in the past that I can think of, but it would be interesting to ask in the future as the threat of cyber warfare becomes more relevant to people's lives, and especially the type of questions that we ask about, power relationships in the world of war and peace might actually, it might be a good question to ask people if they're aware of these sort of changes in the nature of warfare and whether they see particular parties as being more competent in it or more aggressive with it. So it's definitely a good question. I mean, we know the international image of Russia and China and the U.S. and how they compare, and basically, the United States and China are about equal in terms of global favorability, and Russia is much lower. People don't look as favorably upon Russia as they do those two other countries. So that's something in the future we'll also be able to track and see if that changes too as certain potential conflicts spring up across the globe.
So I'd like to ask the question about relevance for policy, these findings. And I'll do it in this way. Last year, 30,000 Americans were killed by guns. 50,000 Americans died from the opioid epidemic, and over 30,000 Americans were killed in auto accidents. So 100,000 dead Americans from these three causes. And during that same period, a dozen or so Americans were killed from terrorist incidents. So if I'm a policymaker, what should be my criteria of choice as to where I'm going to put national resources and attention? Should it be on terrorist threats, or should it be on this range of other activities that are killing Americans at far, far greater numbers?
It's an excellent question.
Well, I'll take a stab at it, Kaz. You know, it should be placed on these other issues that you talked about, but it won't be, simply because you do have this public poll that shows the sensitivity of the public to terrorism. And no U.S. president wants to suffer, you know, another 9/11 on his watch or her watch. So terrorism will be farther up there. And then, you know, the guns thing, how many, you know, high school killings and middle school killings, I mean, do we have to have before we learn about this? But I think all of us, I mean, don't know when or if that will ever happen. I mean, and then politically, anything to do with gun control is just impossible to solve. So unfortunately, you know, you also have the political problems of solving these other is probably more difficult than hardening borders, tracking, pouring more money into the intelligence community, trying to track terrorists.
So I think you've posited a very rational, analytic, you know, shouldn't there be a fairness principle here of what motivates policymakers? But, you know, when you overlay the politics, you find that some of these issues are toxic and some of them aren't. I would say right now, we're getting a little progress on opioid epidemic. That is now finally, you know, on the table as a public policy crisis that has to be addressed. And even on, you know, the car accidents and the cell phone thing, I feel like our society is beginning to grapple with that. There are harsher penalties now if you're, you know, if you get in a car accident and they can prove that you were on your cell phone. So, I mean, so some of those are societal issues, not external threat issues. But, so I don't think it's static completely, but I would argue that, you know, probably the politics on gun control is the hardest, but there's at least some progress on these others. But, you know, you've been asking all along, you know, are we exaggerating the threat? That's a question you can't really answer because, you know, politicians are going to work with this very subjective data. And nobody gets to say that we know for sure there's 1% chance of a terrorist attack, but a 90% chance of, you know, car accidents. So I think public policy making, unfortunately, doesn't respond to that sort of quantitative analysis as much as it should. Yeah.
Thank you. Just another issue that I think, or at least I consider, should be on the next survey or a survey similar to this. There's sort of been a massive increase in people talking about corrupt governments and police brutality, at least in the US, but then also in other countries that have issues with that. Like, if this poll was to go out now and people were to respond, where do you think that would fall in certain countries, and at least in people, how would people consider that?
What? Consider what?
Police brutality.
Police brutality.
Corruption.
Yeah, I mean, so these questions are supposed to be sort of a global in nature, and not necessarily what people in their own countries feel. And I said earlier that economy and terrorism tend to rise to the top, but corruption too is a high topic of it's a problem in many of the countries in which we survey when we ask specifically about corruption. In fact, we did a survey a couple years ago in about the same number of countries, and crime and corruption were clearly seen as the top problems internal to each of the countries. So corruption on a global scale, I don't know if you can really ask more about that. That might have to do more with financial institutions, the movement of money across borders and those kinds of issues and whether they're a threat or not. But it's definitely intertwined with how people, are concerned about their own lives and how that transfers to thoughts about the globe as a whole.
Corruption issue is intertwined also with development of countries. Countries that are more corrupt tend to be less developed, and it becomes a huge issue when companies are thinking about where to invest. The Global Risk Report that the World Economic Forum does, I think they call it failure of national governance, but you'll see that looming as one of the top risks that just every year pops up as one of the big items. So I encourage you to take a look at that one, but that's huge.
About interconnectivity, if you think about like state corruption or state violence, you could tie the refugee crisis or ISIS in Syria to sort of what the regime did there, and so it gets to like these are all interwoven in domino effect. One last question.
To what extent can insurance mitigate some of these risks?
I think we've talked about a lot of risks today, but there's a lot of them that can be insured. Are there some specific ones that you're particularly concerned about? Yeah, so there's a lot of different, with insurance, you always have to be more specific because like somebody will come to me and say, can we cover Brexit? What do you mean? Are you worried about your stock market portfolio crashing because of a hard Brexit? Or are you worried about tariffs going way up and your supply chain becoming too expensive for you to operate? Or so with something like climate change, it's, of course, the insurance market can cover all kinds of catastrophic weather risk. Even temperature changes, like ski resorts can buy weather catastrophe bonds against the risk that their revenue drops because that winter there's no snow or very little snow. So there's a lot of innovation in the insurance markets, a lot of different ways that different risks can be covered, but you've got to narrow in on exactly what you're worried about.
I think we're done. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks for taking part in the survey. And thank you to the panel. Here are the final results.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I should turn my mic off.